equals the grandfather clock in the hall was the only thing in the house that still held its nerve. Each tick was a clean, sharp sound cutting through the damp silence, a silver needle stitching one empty moment to the next. Tamsin Grimwood stood by the window, watching the freezing rain bead and slither down the glass, blurring the skeletal remains of the garden. The cold had seeped through the stone walls weeks ago. Now it felt as if it were emanating from her own bones. Grief was supposed to be a fire, a great, roaring inferno that consumed you. Hers was just this, a deep, hollowing cold. She heard the carriage wheels on the gravel before she saw it, a sound of grating impatience. Her husband's sons, of course, they hadn't waited a respectable month. The front door opened without a knock, and their voices, thick with a shared, brutish confidence, echoed up the stairs. "Mother," Osric called, his tone pitched to a frequency of false concern that set her teeth on edge. Tamsin didn't move from the window. She let them find her in the dim light of the study, standing beside the empty hearth. They brought the smell of wet wool and entitlement into the room. "There you are," Gareth the younger grunted. He was softer than his brother, his greed padded with a layer of indolence. Osric was all sharp angles and sharper eyes. He took in the state of the room, the threadbare rug, the single candle burning on the mantelpiece, and his lip curled. "The creditors have been to see us," Osric began, dispensing with pleasantries. "It seems father's affairs were creatively managed." Tamsin turned from the window. Her reflection in the dark pane was a specter of exhaustion, her dark hair showing the first shocking streaks of silver at the temples. It was the only thing of value her husband had left her. "Your father was a poet who wrote in ledger books," she said, her voice low and brittle from disuse. "His currency was promises." Promises that are now due," Osric snapped. "The London house is forfeit. The shipping interests are worthless. Everything this side of the river is mortgaged to the hilt, which leaves only one thing." He looked around the room again, his gaze lingering on the faded portrait of a grim-faced ancestor above the mantel. The original charter, the Blackwood grant. Her heart, a cold, sluggish thing in her chest, gave a painful lurch. The source, the poisoned well from which the Grimwood name had drawn its dark prestige for centuries. "That is not yours to claim. It is ours by blood," Gareth blustered. "We are his sons." "And I was his wife," Tamsin countered, the words tasting like ash. "He left me with his name and his debts. He left you with his appetites." A shiver racked her body, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. Fear, the old, familiar fear of destitution, of being cast out. She pressed her hand against the cold stone of the fireplace to steady herself. Osric laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "The name is worthless if the coffers are empty. We'll go to the manor. We'll speak to the old man ourselves. Invoke the blood claim. He'll settle father's accounts." The shivering stopped. It did not fade away. It was burned off by a sudden, rising heat that started in her gut. It wasn't courage. It was rage, pure and clean as distilled poison. It was so much warmer than fear. Her hand, steady now, fell to her side. "You will do no such thing," she said, and the change in her voice was so profound that both men took a half step back. The brittle edge was gone, replaced by something smooth and dense as polished granite. "You are weak. You are greedy. You would go to him as beggars, and he would consume you for the impertinence." "He is our grandsire," Gareth stammered. "He is not a man," Tamsin said, the words falling like chips of ice into the silence. "He is a principle of winter. You cannot reason with winter. You can only endure it, or you can find something it wants." She finally looked at them, truly looked at them, and saw them not as the brutish stepsons who had made her life a misery, but as dull, predictable instruments. "Leave my house." They left, not with grace, but with the shuffling, resentful air of dogs kicked away from a carcass. The front door slammed, shaking the house. The silence that rushed back in was different now. It was no longer empty. It was waiting, Equals Tamsin walked to her husband's mahogany desk. She slid open a locked drawer with a key from the chain around her neck. Inside, nestled on black velvet, was not a jewel or a stack of coins, but a single ornately carved chess piece. A white queen, wrought from what looked like yellowed bone. Her husband had called it an invitation, a relic from a game he had been too cowardly to ever play himself. She closed her fingers around it. The bone was cold, but did not chill her. She was already cold enough. Equals the journey to Blackwood Manor was a descent. The road narrowed, the ancient trees closing in overhead until they blotted out the meager gray light of the afternoon sky. The air grew still and thin, smelling of stone and frozen earth. When the carriage could go no further, the driver refused to wait, his eyes wide with peasant superstition. Tamsin paid him and walked the last mile alone, the bone queen clutched in her pocket. Equals the manor did not loom. It simply was a sprawl of black stone and gabled roofs that seemed to drink the light from the air. There was no sign of life, no smoke from the chimneys, no light in the 100 darkened windows. Dust sheets, visible through the tall, grimy panes of glass, looked like congregations of ghosts. The only sound was the crunch of her own boots on the black gravel. The silence here was a presence, a physical pressure against her eardrums. Equals the great oak doors were not locked. They swung inward on silent hinges, opening into a hall that was colder than the world outside. A vast, vaulted space where chandeliers hung like crystalline insects caught in a web of frost. Tamsin's breath plumed in front of her. She walked across the marble floor, her footsteps making no echo, as if the very air were too dense to carry sound. She knew where to go. Her husband's terrified, half-drunken ramblings had painted a map in her mind. Up the grand staircase, past the gallery of portraits whose eyes seemed filmed over with cataracts of dust, and to the library at the heart of the West Wing. Equals the library doors were ajar. Inside, a single source of light glowed with the cold, steady luminescence of a winter moon. It came from a lamp on a large table in the center of the room. Seated at the table, perfectly still, was a man. He did not look old, not in the way mortals did. His face was a mask of alabaster, unlined perfection, framed by a fall of hair so blonde it was almost white, flowing like his distinctive mane past his shoulders. He wore a high-collared coat of black velvet that seemed to absorb the faint light around him. Only his eyes, a startling pale gray, seemed alive. They were fixed on the chessboard before him. Equals Tamsin felt the silver at her own temples tingle, a strange resonance with the absolute lack of color in him. He was the source. Drystan, the grandsire, the winter. She approached the table without a word. He did not acknowledge her, his attention utterly captive to the game. It was a peculiar setup. All the black pieces were in place, an army arrayed for war. But on the other side of the board, there was only a single, solitary white king. An impossible position, she said, her voice quiet but clear in the profound stillness. Equals his head lifted slowly, his pale eyes swept over her, taking in her travel-worn dress, the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the defiant set of her jaw. There was no surprise in his expression, only a deep, ancient weariness. Impossibility is a matter of perspective, he murmured. His voice was a low rustle, like dry leaves skittering across ice. Most see only the pieces before them. They fail to account for the pieces not yet in play. He gestured to an empty square on her side of the board. Tamsin understood. She reached in her pocket, her fingers closing around the bone queen. She placed it on the indicated square. It clicked softly against the marble. Equals a smile touched his lips then. It was a terrifying and beautiful thing, a fractional shift of his features that held no warmth, only a chilling, intellectual delight. The first genuine expression she had seen. "You have come to bargain for your husband's failures," he stated. It was not a question. "I have come to collect on his assets," Tamsin corrected, her gaze unwavering. "The Grimwood name, you value it." My stepsons seek to tarnish it with their begging. Their creditors seek to dismantle it. I will not allow that. And what do you offer me, Tamsin Grimwood, to intervene in the tedious affairs of mortal debt? Equals a player, she said simply, one who understands the board, one who is not afraid to sacrifice a pawn or a knight to protect the king. Her eyes flickered to the pieces, then back to his. The subtext hung in the frozen air between them. Her sons. Drystan leaned back his chair, a slow, fluid movement. The ancient, predatory grace of it made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. He studied her for a long, silent moment, his gray eyes seeming to peel back the layers of her grief and desperation to see the cold, hard resolve beneath. Equals, I will erase the debts, he said, his voice a silken promise. I will silence the creditors. I will give you the means to bring your sons to heel, to make them kneel and recognize the authority of their father's house, an authority that will now be yours. The Grimwood name will be spoken with fear and respect once more. He paused, letting the weight of his offer settle. In return, you will be my agent in the world. My will, my eyes, your service to this house will be absolute. She had expected conditions. She had expected a terrible price. She was a woman with nothing left to lose, and, therefore, nothing she was unwilling to pay. Equals, I accept, she said, the words leaving her lips without a trace of hesitation. Drystan's terrible, beautiful smile widened, and he reached across the board, his long, bone-white fingers gesturing to the lone white king. Equals, then make your first move, my queen. The shivering was a deep, cellular thing, a vibration that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the body's final, useless argument against the reality the mind had already accepted. Tamsin Grimwood stood in the shadow of the obsidian throne, the echo of a man's disintegration still clinging to the air like the scent of ozone after a lightning strike. King Drystan Ashcroft had not moved. He remained a silhouette of terrible grace, one long-fingered hand resting on the arm of the throne, the other loose at his side. The silence he commanded was heavier than any sound. Equals Tamsin's teeth chattered, a frantic, tiny percussion in the cavernous hall. Stop it, she told herself, the command a weak whisper in the storm of her panic. He'll think you're weak. He'll think you're prey. But her body wouldn't listen. It remembered the cold of the streets, the gnawing hunger, the terror of being hunted. This was just a new kind of cold, a new kind of hunger, a new kind of hunt. Equals, and then something shifted. The cold didn't recede, but a new sensation met it, pushing back. It started in her belly, a hard, hot knot of pure indignation. Indignation at her own trembling limbs, at the casual, cosmic cruelty that had brought her here, at the creature on the throne who had shattered a man into atoms and now watched her with the placid curiosity of a god examining an insect. The heat spread, a slow burn up her spine, into her shoulders, down her arms. It was anger, a bitter, useless, and utterly magnificent anger. And anger was warmer than fear. The shivering stopped. Equals her breathing even out, her posture straightening by a fraction of an inch. She met Drystan's gaze across the expanse of polished black stone. She did not see his eyes, only the faint, silver glint where they should be. You are resilient. Drystan's voice was not a sound, but a presence, a low resonance that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the manor. Most would have shattered by now. Tamsin's throat was dry, her tongue a leaden weight. She forced a single word out, the texture of it like sand. Why? Why did I choose you? Or why did I unmake your predecessor? The question was calm, academic. Both. The word was stronger this time. Equals Lord Valerius was a blunt instrument in an era that requires a scalpel. He saw power as a hammer, and every problem a nail. As for you, he rose, and the movement was so fluid it seemed the world was moving around him, not the other way around. His long hair, the color of liquid mercury, shifted around his shoulders. You survived for 20 years in a city that feasts on the weak. You managed assets, navigated bylaws, and manipulated systems designed to crush you. You built a life from scraps and held it together with nothing but sheer, bloody-minded tenacity. I do not need another hammer, Tamsin Grimwood. I need an architect. Equals he descended the dais, his steps utterly silent on the stone. He stopped a dozen feet from her, close enough now that she could see the unnatural perfection of his features. The platinum blonde hair, so starkly different from the tired silver strands at her own temples. He was an ageless, beautiful predator, and she was a thing of seasons, of decay. Equals my court is in chaos, he continued, his tone shifting to one of mild annoyance, as if discussing a poorly managed estate. My territories are frayed. My vassals bicker and plot. My enemies, both mortal and otherwise, circle like vultures. My general, Lorcan, believes the solution is to march an army into the heart of the city and burn it to the ground. Equals he gestured, and a section of the wall behind the throne shimmered, dissolving not into an opening, but into a map. It was a living thing of light and shadow, a three-dimensional representation of the city and its surrounding territories. Red lines pulsed with threat, blue flickered with contested influence, and vast swathes of it were chaotic, contested gray. Equals a tantrum, Drystan said with disdain. Not a strategy. He would win the battle and lose the war, leaving me to rule over a kingdom of ash and bone. An inconvenience. He turned his full attention back to her. You, on the other hand, understand the city's arteries. Not the streets, but the flow of coin, of information, of power. You see the cracks in the foundations. Show me. Equals it wasn't a request. Tamsin walked towards the shimmering map, her worn boots making a soft, grating sound that felt obscenely loud. She felt the weight of his stare on her back, a physical pressure. Standing before the map, her fear tried to return, a cold whisper at the edge of the anger. She pushed it down. She was a city planner, a logistician. This was a system, and every system had a breaking point. Equals the map was a nightmare of overlapping jurisdictions and ancient feuds. General Lorcan, a towering figure in polished black plate, stepped from the shadows near the map, his presence a wall of cold iron and contempt. His hair was the same platinum as Drystan's, but cropped brutally short. My king, Lorcan's voice was a gravelly baritone. This is a waste of time. The mortal is terrified. Give me 3 legions, and I will bring you the mayor's head on a spike by moonrise. Your strategy lacks subtlety, Lorcan. As usual, Drystan said without turning. Proceed, Mistress Grimwood. Equals Tamsin's eyes scanned the map, ignoring the general's dismissive posture. She wasn't looking at troop movements or fortified positions. She was looking at what wasn't there. She pointed a trembling finger at a network of faint, pulsing green lines deep within the city's oldest quarter. What are these? Old sewer lines and forgotten service tunnels, Lorcan scoffed. Unused for a century. Impassable. They're not impassable, Tamsin said, her voice gaining confidence. They're just not on your maps. They run beneath the Merchants Guild, the City Watch headquarters, and here. Her finger landed on a large, glowing blue node. The aqueduct system's primary pumping station. The city gets 2/3 of its fresh water from here. Equals Lorcan was silent. Drystan tilted his head, a gesture of nascent interest. Equals, you don't need to burn the city. Tamsin continued, the pieces clicking into place, the familiar thrill of solving a complex puzzle momentarily eclipsing her terror. The scent of dry, ancient parchment and the faint, coppery tang of old blood from Lorcan's gauntlets filled the air, grounding her. You don't need a frontal assault. You create a crisis. A subtle one. Taint the water supply. Not with poison. That's too obvious. Introduce something that causes sickness, panic. While the City Watch is distracted with riots over water, you use these tunnels to consolidate power here. Her finger traced a path. And here, you disrupt their supply lines, their grain shipments. Starve them out. Turn the populace against their leaders. Let them hand you the city on a platter. Equal she finished, her heart pounding. She had laid herself bare, shown him the workings of her mind. There was a long, profound silence. It stretched thin and terrible. Lorcan stared at her, his expression a mask of disbelief and reluctant assessment. Then Drystan Ashcroft smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was the sharp, beautiful, and utterly terrifying sight of a predator recognizing a kindred spirit. It was a flash of white teeth in the gloom, a glint of approval that promised nothing but more danger, more complicated cages. It was the most frightening thing she had ever seen. Equals an architect, Drystan breathed the words. Indeed. He turned to his general. Lorcan, you will provide Mistress Grimwood with access to the archives, logistical support, and a security detail. She is to be considered my hand. Her directives will be treated as my own. Do you understand? The muscle in Lorcan's jaw twitched. As you command, my king. The words were correct, but the tone was laced with insolent fury. Drystan's smile vanished. Good. Sybil will show you to your new quarters, Tamsin. They belonged to Lord Valerius. I trust you will find them adequate. Equals Sybil, the pale, silent attendant, materialized at her elbow. Tamsin allowed herself to be led away, the weight of Lorcan's hatred a tangible force on her back. As she walked, she glanced back. Drystan was watching her, his mercury hair catching the faint light, a king who had just acquired a new, fascinating, and utterly disposable tool. Equals the chambers were a testament to decayed opulence. A massive four-poster bed was draped in silks, so old they tore if you looked at them too intently. A grand fireplace stood cold and silent, its marble mantelpiece coated in a fine layer of gray dust. The air was thick with the scent of freezing rain, and something else, something cloying and sweet like dried flowers. Dust sheets, like shrouded ghosts, covered most of the furniture. Through a tall, arched window, the moon cast a single, perfect beam of light, illuminating a slow-drifting flake of dust as it fell to land on the faded velvet of a chaise lounge. Equals, the king has granted you access to the manor's resources, Sybil said, her voice a monotone. She placed a heavy iron key on a small, dust-free table. The library is yours. The scribes are yours. The thralls will attend you. General Lorcan is not. Tamsin turned to face the woman. Sybil's eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, her expression unreadable. What do you want, Sybil? Want? I am the king's chamberlain. I want what he wants. Order. That's a lie, Tamsin said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She was too tired for games. Sybil's lips curved in a microscopic smile. Very good. I want to survive, just like you. Lord Valerius was a fool. He thought loyalty was a shield. It is not. Usefulness is a shield, and even that has an expiration date. She glided towards a door. A word of advice, Tamsin Grimwood. The king values novelty, but he tires of his toys eventually. Make sure that when he does, you have built your own cage to hide in, because the one he provides will vanish. The door clicked shut, leaving Tamsin alone in the vast dead room. The silence was broken only by the incessant, low-frequency hum of the manor itself, a sound that seemed to vibrate in her bones. It was the sound of ancient power, dormant but not dead. Her new cage. For a moment, the enormity of it all threatened to drown her. Her sons, Osric and Finn. She squeezed her eyes shut, their faces swimming in her mind. She was doing this for them. She had to believe that. Usefulness was a shield. The next few days blurred into a cycle of paranoid productivity. Tamsin worked from the dead lord's chambers, poring over ancient maps and logistical ledgers brought by silent, terrified thralls. She didn't sleep. She subsisted on stale bread and watered wine left outside her door, a prisoner in a gilded cage. She issued her first directives on heavy parchment, her signature feeling alien and presumptuous. They were small things at first, rerouting patrols, commissioning new surveys of the tunnels, cross-referencing old tax records with known guild loyalties. Each one was a stone thrown into a dark pond, and she waited for the ripples. The first ripple was Lorcan. Equals he appeared in her doorway, without knocking, his bulk filling the frame. He didn't enter, merely stood on the threshold, a monument of disapproval. The hum of the manor's power conduits seemed to grow louder in his presence. "You are diverting scouts from the western perimeter," he stated, not a question. "The western perimeter is stable," Tamsin replied, without looking up from her work. "The primary threat is internal rot, not external assault. I need those scouts to verify the tunnel access points near the granary. My scouts are not errand boys for your cartography projects." Tamsin finally looked up, meeting his cold, furious gaze. "They're the king's scouts, General, and the king has tasked me with securing this city. Your methods are loud and costly. Mine are quiet and efficient. If you have a problem with my directives, you're free to take it up with him." She held his gaze, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She was invoking the king's authority, hiding behind it, as Sybil had warned her not to. But it was the only weapon she had. Lorcan's hand clenched into a fist at his side, the black leather of his gauntlet creaking. For a terrifying second, Tamsin thought he would cross the threshold and simply snap her neck. The sheer physical power radiating from him was suffocating. "You are a temporary amusement, mortal," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "Do not forget it. When your clever little schemes fail, my legions will be there to clean up the mess. And you with it." He turned and was gone, his silence more threatening than any shout. Tamsin let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her hands shaking. She had won the exchange, but she had made a powerful enemy. The victory tasted like ash. She forced herself back to the maps, the familiar logic of lines and numbers of balm to her frayed nerves. She worked relentlessly, driven by a desperate need to prove Sybil wrong, to make her shield of usefulness so dense, so impenetrable, that Drystan would never tire of her. She began to see the court not as a collection of immortal monsters, but as a dysfunctional corporation. The bickering vassals were inefficient department heads. Lorcan was a belligerent head of security, obsessed with outdated protocols. And Drystan was the CEO, brilliant, ruthless, and utterly detached from the day-to-day operations. She could fix this. She could streamline it. She could make it work. A week after her confrontation with Lorcan, a summons came. Not to the throne room, but to the grand gallery. Drystan required her presence. When she entered, she saw why. The gallery, a long hall lined with faded tapestries and lifeless statues, was filled with dozens of the lesser vampire nobles. They stood in tense, silent clusters, their platinum hair gleaming in the cold light. Drystan stood on a low dais at the far end, and to his right, on a slightly smaller, unadorned chair, was a space. For her, her blood ran cold. This was a test, a public one. She walked the length of the hall, feeling their collective gaze on her. A mixture of contempt, curiosity, and predatory interest. She was a curiosity, a mortal elevated, a pet. Her plain, dark-wool dress and the silver streaks in her hair were a stark proclamation of her otherness. She took her seat, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap to hide their trembling. Disputes have arisen concerning the allocation of knightly territories, Drystan announced to the hall, his voice carrying effortlessly. Resources are thin. Blood is scarce. My hand will now arbitrate. Her word is mine. He leaned back, leaving her exposed. One by one, the nobles came forward, laying out their petty squabbles and ancient grievances. Tamsin listened, her mind racing. This wasn't about justice. It was about power, about demonstrating control. She used their own arcane laws against them, citing precedent from ledgers she had memorized in the dead of night. She was fair but firm, her rulings based on cold, hard logic, not ancient feuds. She gave a little to one, took a little from another, reweaving the tapestry of power in the room, with herself at the center. The initial murmurs of discontent slowly died down, replaced by a grudging, wary respect. She was good at this, terrifyingly good. Equal for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt a flicker of something other than fear or anger. It was a faint, dangerous glimmer of control. As the last noble retreated, bowing stiffly, a commotion came from the main doors. They swung open, revealing two of Lorien's guards, their black plate armor immaculate. They were holding someone between them, a boy, struggling, his face ashen with terror. Tamsin's breath caught in her throat. The flicker of control died, smothered by a tidal wave of ice. It was Osric, her son. Equals he looked thin, his clothes ragged, his eyes wide and uncomprehending as he scanned the monstrous assembly. Then his eyes found her, sitting on the dais, beside the Vampire King. The look on his face was a portrait of shattered reality, confusion, betrayal, and a depth of fear that mirrored her own. Mother! The word was a choked, broken thing. Before Tamsin could move, could speak, could scream, a human thrall, wizened and bent, scurried forward. He avoided looking at anyone, his eyes fixed on the floor. He knelt before her, holding out a sealed, official-looking envelope of cheap, coarse paper. Her name was written on it in severe, bureaucratic script. Equals her hands shook uncontrollably as she took it. Her blood was roaring in her ears, drowning out the silence of the court, the sound of her own son's terrified breathing. With numb fingers, she broke the seal. The paper was cold to the touch. The ink was a stark, impersonal black. It wasn't a ransom note. It wasn't a threat from an enemy faction. It was worse. It was a final notice of eviction from the city housing authority for non-payment of rent, effective immediately, for her and her dependents. Osric Grimwood, Tamsin Grimwood, equals the world narrowed to that single, cruel, mundane piece of paper. The smell of cheap ink a nauseating counterpoint to the cold perfume of the vampires. Her shield of usefulness, her grand strategies, her fragile grip on this new reality, all of it dissolved. She was just a woman who couldn't pay her rent, and her son was watching as her world, and his, finally, irrevocably, came to an end. The cold finally stopped. For years, it had been a parasite living under her skin, a constant, shivering reminder of her mortality in a house of stone-hearted immortals. But now, a furnace had ignited in her belly. Anger. It was so much warmer than fear. Equals Tamsin looked at the documents spread across the black oak table, its creamy parchment a stark declaration of war in the gloom. The only sound in the great hall was the metronomic tick-tock of the grandfather clock, each beat counting down the last seconds of her old life. Across from her, her sons, Osric and Lorcan, stood like statues carved from ice and arrogance. Their platinum hair seemed to absorb the meager light, leaving their faces in shadow, their beauty a cruel mask. "You cannot be serious, mother." Osric's voice was a silken threat, the voice he used before a kill. "This little tantrum is over. Put the pen down." Equals Lorcan laughed, a short, ugly sound. "She thinks a piece of paper can bind us. Adorable. Has Drystan filled your head with such fanciful tales?" Beside the hearth, Drystan remained motionless, his hair a cascade of white gold in the firelight. He offered no help, no reassurance. This was her crucible, hers alone. Tamsin's gaze didn't waver from the page. The ancient laws of the bloodline, researched in secret, transcribed by her own trembling hand. Every loophole a scar, every clause a memory of pain. A contract that would strip them of their holdings, their power, their legacy, and chain them to the will of the new matriarch. A title they had never thought to bestow upon a mere human. Equals her hand, once so prone to shaking, was perfectly steady as she reached for the pen. It was heavy, silver, a gift from Osric for her 40th birthday. A trinket to a pet. The irony tasted like blood in her mouth. "I am not putting the pen down," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the vast, cold air of the hall, sharp and clear. The ticking of the clock seemed to hesitate. Equals Osric took a step forward. A predator's grace, coiled and lethal. "You have no idea what you are doing. We are eternal. You're a dying breath. We will simply wait until your pathetic, fleeting life gutters out. Then we will burn this paper and forget you ever drew it up." Tamsin finally looked at him. She saw not the boy she had raised, but the monster she had born. The silver in her own hair, once a source of shame, now felt like a crown of frost, a sign of wisdom earned through suffering. She was winter, and winter had come for them. "Equals, you misunderstand," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "The contract is not bound to my life. It is bound to the house, to the blood. It is already done. This," she tapped the signature line with the nib of the pen, "is merely the ritual, the final courtesy." Panic, stark and unfamiliar, flashed in Osric's eyes. Lorcan's smirk faltered. They exchanged a look, a silent, frantic conversation that spanned a fraction of a second. They had underestimated her. They had forgotten that the mouse, cornered for a lifetime, learns every crack in the floorboards, every weakness in the walls of its cage. Equals, Tamsin lowered the pen. The scratch of the nib on the parchment was a shriek in the suffocating silence. TMSGen. The ink was black absolute. Her name, a brand seared into their future. The final letter curled with a flourish she didn't know she possessed. Her hand fell away. Done. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The clock ticked. The dust motes danced in the pale moonlight, slanting through the towering, grime-caked windows. Then the world roared. Equals, the fireplace behind Drystan exploded, not with a crackle of wood, but with a concussive blast of white-hot flame that shot out into the room, a hungry, spectral tongue. The heat was a physical blow, pressing the air from Tamsin's lungs. The sound was a violation, a screeching inferno that clawed at her ears. Shadows, twisted and monstrous, writhed across the walls, a ballet of demons celebrating a birth. Equals, through the shimmering heat haze, Tamsin saw it. Drystan turned his head, and for the first time in the century she had known him, he smiled. It was not a kind expression. It was the terrible, beautiful satisfaction of a master artist seeing his magnum opus complete. A look of devastating, triumphant pride. And then, the payment came due. It didn't start with wait. It started with a choke. Lorcan opened his mouth to scream, to command the shadows to attack, but no sound came out. Instead, a thick, viscous black liquid spilled over his lips. Ink. Equals, the same stark, impersonal black ink Tamsin had used to sign their fate. It poured from his mouth, choking his protest, staining his pristine chin like oil. He clawed at his throat, eyes bulging, as the taste of the contract filled his lungs. Osric stumbled back, gasping. The air around him had turned to ash gray, suffocating flakes of the burnt paper swirling into a vortex. He tried to speak, to invoke his blood right, but he coughed out a cloud of dry, bitter soot. The magic wasn't crushing them. It was drowning them in the bureaucracy they had mocked. Equals, Lorcan hit the floor first, retching up the dark symbols of his lost authority. Osric followed, his legs giving way as the ash filled his nose and mouth, forcing him to bow to catch a breath of clean air. He looked up at Tamsin through streaming, blackened eyes. There was no promise of war in his gaze anymore, only the terrified realization that the house didn't just want his submission. It wanted his silence. Equals, Tamsin rose from the table. The furnace inside her was now a calm, steady pilot light. She walked past her kneeling sons, ignoring them as one would ignore furniture. She held the silver pen in her hand. It felt obscene now, a relic of a forgotten age. She reached the hearth. The unnatural flames licked at the air, casting her face in a flickering, demonic glow. They did not burn her. They welcomed her. She opened her hand and let the pen drop into the heart of the white-hot inferno. The silver blackened, curled, and then dissolved into nothing its purpose served. The ritual was complete. Equals, slowly, the impossible roar of the fire subsided, shrinking back into the hearth until it was just a low, contented hum. Silence flooded the hall, a thick, heavy blanket of consequence. It was louder than the screams had been. Tamsin stood there for a long time, feeling the echo of the power that had surged through her. It left an emptiness in its wake, a hollow ache where a lifetime of fear and sorrow had once lived. Victory was not a feeling of joy. It was a vast, desolate quiet, the quiet of a battlefield after the fighting is done. Equal she turned. Her gaze swept over the dust sheets that clung to the furniture like forgotten ghosts, over the chandelier that hung from the high ceiling, its crystals weeping frozen tears of dust. This was her kingdom now, a kingdom of decay and shadows. Her feet, silent on the cold stone, carried her to the dais at the far end of the hall, where the matriarch's throne sat, empty for 300 years. It was not ornate. It was carved from the same black oak as the table, stark and severe. A seat of judgment, not comfort. She sat. Equals the cold of the wood seeped through her dress, a familiar feeling, but different now. It was not the cold of a victim, but the cold of a monument. From his knees, Osric finally lifted his head. His face, illuminated by the now-tamed fire, was stripped bare of all its arrogance, all its pride. He looked at his mother, at the woman with the silvering hair who sat on the throne of his ancestors, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Not as a vessel, not as a convenience, but as the architect of his ruin, a power ancient and elemental, born not of blood, but of a will forged in the fires of absolute despair. Tamsin met his gaze. She felt nothing, not triumph, not pity, not love, just the silent, endless hum of the house, its power now hers to command. The clock on the wall continued to tick, but it was no longer counting down to her end. It was counting for them.